Okay, HSA, I'm going to try to do a camera purchasing rundown quick and dirty video for you as best as I can. This is like a huge rabbit hole because there's all kinds of variations and everybody has their own opinion on how things work. Like I used to be a big megapixels don't matter kind of guy, but in this situation, I'm going to use megapixels as a way to, I don't know, communicate about how you're going to pick a camera. First off, your camera, being that the review that you were talking about was written in 2009, we obviously know that your camera is older and it is old in technology standards. And so it'd probably be a good idea to get a new camera anyways, because the color degradation and like the inconsistency of your camera, it basically, I would say the sensor in your camera is wearing out and finally trying to give up the ghost. And so it would be good to get a new camera. You were talking about this Canon PowerShot S110. This is a very good camera in a lot of ways. There's a couple cons about it that I will show you, and I also will compare it to another camera, and I'll talk to you about the big goofy looking cameras that you asked me about. The PowerShot S110, this is a really good camera in my opinion. The things that I look at that I really like is the ISO range. This has a huge ISO range that goes from 80 to 12800, which is just massive. And the ISO is how the camera deals with low lighting. The darker your setting gets, the camera is going to bump up the ISO to basically try to gather up as much information from your image as it gets darker, the ISO will go up. Now there's a few things. Some cameras have not very good ISO and some have really good ISO. Canon actually has a very good ISO in my opinion. What happens is as the image gets darker and the ISO goes up, the grainier the image gets and the less sharp it gets. So the wider the ISO range you have, the better chance you get a better image in lower quality, because you don't jump from one number to a drastically big number. And I'll show you why here in a second what I mean by that. The other thing too is there's a con about this one is it has a 5 times optical zoom. Most point and shoots nowadays have a 10 power, but you're making up for the zoom by having a little bit better ISO and a little bit better sensor in the camera. The thing that is, a lot of people don't know how to equate the 5 times zoom to like camera focal lengths, but here they give you that information. This has a maximum focal length of 120 millimeters, which is actually pretty good. Most kit lenses that come with SLRs is in the 120 range, usually 15 to 80 or 24 to 120. So this is going to be really close to that. And then the minimum focal length is 24. And the lower the focal length number, the wider the camera can pick up. So the wider lens. And 24 is actually considered a wide angle lens. So this technically has a wide angle lens. The other thing too that I would look at on this guy is the aperture. So the minimum aperture, if you're looking at aperture, is you want the lowest aperture as possible and a highest aperture as possible, so you have the widest range. The lower the aperture, and what makes this guy really cool that I like, is the minimum aperture is an f-stop of 2. Most like standard 50 millimeter just prime lenses that people use to get like that really nice shot and the background is like completely blurry, that is a f-stop of 1.8 or 1. So this is going to be really close to that, so you'll be able to take images and have a lovely blurry background, and the images, whatever your subject is going to pop. And so that's really cool. The maximum aperture on this is kind of a bummer, but it's not a big deal. It's only matters if you're going to do a lot of scenery photos and stuff. It's still going to do fine by most people's standards. Is its maximum aperture is 5.9. Another thing to look at with these apertures, the lower the number you got, the more light the image will, or the camera will take in, which also helps in low light photography as well, allowing you to keep a better quality image without using as much ISO, which will keep a sharper and less grainy image. The higher the aperture, the less light is let in, and the shutter has to stay open longer, and it allows more for blur and stuff. So it works better for taking pictures of stationary things like that. Another thing about this camera that I got, most of them come with it, or you're looking at, is it does have an autofocus and manual focus, which is really a good feature because you never know, you might want to get a little fancy and focus on a very specific part of a subject, but not change the position of your camera. And when the camera's running in smart mode, it will decide for you, and sometimes it won't always focus on what you want, especially like animals like your dogs and things like that. Now, you're like kind of, well, like, okay, you just told me all that stuff, but there really isn't much to compare to. This is an ELPH 340 HS. It's a cheaper camera, $150, 16 megapixels. Really not that big of a difference as in image size and quality. So don't let that fool you. The other thing is this thing has a 12 optical zoom, so it's over double the zoom length of the 110. But I'll show you where it kind of starts faulting. Is if you look at it, just so you can look, is the minimum focal length is 25 millimeters. So it's one step above, so it's really not a wide angle lens by wide angle lens standards because it's not a 24, but who cares? But the maximum focal length is 300 millimeter, which is really big. I don't even have a 300 millimeter lens. I have a 250 millimeter lens for one of my SLRs that I use. The other thing too is if you look at the apertures, so the maximum aperture is 3.6 to 7, so it does have a higher aperture, so you can actually get a little bit better scenery photos and things like that. But the minimum aperture is a 3.6, which is not as good. You're not going to get that lovely blurry background on things like that. So I wouldn't really take this camera because I would rather pick the camera with an aperture of f-stop of 2 of minimum and the 5.6 or whatever it is. Now this is the seller on this camera. You think, well, I could deal with that or whatever. This is where the money, you save all this money, is right here. Here's your ISO. 100 to 3200. That's it. So it doesn't even have a clean enough ISO. What happens is as you're taking pictures and the lighting's changing, this thing's going to be jumping huge gaps. 200, 400, 800. That's going to be jumping gaps of 200, and then once it goes to 800, which is pretty, that's like kind of standard dark dim, photographs. Not dim, I don't even know how to explain what dim, like right, this lighting, you would need a ISO of 800. Doesn't look like much, but when you go to 800 to 1600, now you've doubled, and the graininess is just going to go nuts. You're going to lose your sharpness. You're going to lose the fidelity of the image, and that's just what sucks. This is a huge selling point on the camera. That's why it's so much cheaper, is because the sensor is not that good. It does have a manual focus, which is cool. If you're on a budget, this camera would probably do fine for you, and it would work well for web-based photography like you want. But if you were to get a camera, this is the guy I would get, despite the zoom not being as good. Everything else, this camera rocks. This S110 is going to be an amazing camera for you, in my opinion. That being said, I am a Canon guy. You were talking about being, open to change and things like that. I definitely, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you know how to use it, just keep using it. I've used Sony's, I've used Nikon's. I've always liked how Canons work. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that. Now you asked about these big Herkin looking mothers where it looks like a point and shoot and a SLR got together and had a baby. Basically, this is for somebody that wants like the SLR performance of an SLR, but not the complications of it. If you look at it, it's got a 30 power zoom. I think the thing is equivalent to 700 millimeters, which is giant. Yeah, 720 millimeters. So it just gives you huge amounts of zoom, and that's mainly the big deal about that camera. But if you look down here, there's the ISO, 80 to 1600. So even less than that cheaper $150 point and shoot. And this guy is $239.99. So if you don't need a far zoom, I would probably stick with that S110. But my screen capture is going to run out of time. So I will talk to you later. If you need anything else from me, just let me know. I hope some of this information helped you. I'm a terrible teacher. I don't even know why I'm on YouTube. Just kidding. I love YouTube. And HSA, you kick butt.